The fog rolled in quickly across the marshlands, unnaturally thick and cold for a summer evening. Emma froze as the distant church bells fell silent mid-toll. Something massive moved in the mist ahead, something with eyes like burning coals and breath that reeked of the grave. Too late, she remembered her grandmother's warning: if you hear no sound but your own heartbeat in the fog, run. The Black Shuck has come to claim a soul. This chilling tale from England's misty coastline will make you question what lurks in the fog. If you're brave enough to discover the truth behind the Black Shuck legend, make sure you're subscribed and hit that like button to summon more folklore horror from the darkest corners of the world. In the coastal villages of East Anglia, where England's shoreline crumbles year by year into the hungry North Sea, the oldest families still observe rituals their neighbors find peculiar. They hang rowan and bells above their doors. They paint their garden gates with curious symbols. They never venture out when sea fog rolls inland after sunset. And most peculiarly, they keep their dogs indoors on the night of a new moon, whispering that like calls to like when the sky holds no light. Most locals dismiss these as quaint superstitions, remnants of a more credulous time before electric lights pushed back the darkness. But anthropologist Dr. Marcus Blackwood recognized them as living fragments of a belief system dating back to Viking settlements and perhaps earlier. It was why he'd chosen the village of Dunwich for his sabbatical research. Defensive folk practices, Marcus explained to his research assistant, Emma Lloyd, as they unpacked equipment in the cottage they'd rented for the summer. They persist for centuries after people forget what they were defending against. Emma nodded absently, more focused on setting up her camera gear than listening to another lecture. At 26, she'd already established herself as one of the most promising visual anthropologists of her generation, with a particular talent for documenting rituals and traditions before they vanished forever. And what exactly were they defending against? She asked, more to show she was listening than out of genuine curiosity. The Black Shuck, Marcus replied, his voice dropping instinctively to a near whisper though they were alone in the cottage. A spectral hound said to roam these coasts. Seeing it was an omen of imminent death. Like the Grim from Harry Potter. Emma smirked as she aligned her tripod. The folklore goes much deeper, Marcus said, not rising to her bait. In some versions, the hound itself is the agent of death, not just its harbinger. The locals believed it was a soul collector, a beast that hunts those whose time has come. Sounds like perfect material for the visual companion piece, Emma said, suddenly more interested. Atmospheric shots of foggy marshlands, recreations of historical encounters. The university press will eat it up. Marcus hesitated. The locals might not appreciate us investigating this particular legend. It's sensitive. Because people still believe in a giant ghost dog. Emma laughed. Because 7 people went missing in this county last year during fog events, Marcus said quietly. All unsolved. All on moonless nights. Emma's smile faded. You can't seriously believe. I believe in respecting local sensitivities, Marcus interrupted. We're here to document their cultural practices, not debunk them or stir up painful memories. Emma nodded, properly chastened. Of course. Professional distance. I understand. But as she finished unpacking her equipment, Emma couldn't help but think what incredible footage a recreation of the Black Shuck legend would make for their documentary. The university had invested significantly in this project, and delivering merely standard documentation of fading rural traditions wouldn't advance her career the way something more memorable would. Perhaps some atmospheric night shooting was in order, with or without Dr. Blackwood's approval. The village of Dunwich clung to the coastline like a stubborn memory. Once a thriving medieval port rivaling London in size and importance, most of the original town had long ago been reclaimed by the sea, which continued its relentless consumption of the shoreline year after year. What remained was a shadow of its former self, a cluster of cottages, a ruined priory, a half-empty pub called the Mariner's Rest, and the old church of St. James, which strangely stood with its back to the ocean rather than facing it. Emma and Marcus spent their first days establishing connections in the village, explaining their research and requesting interviews with the oldest residents. Many doors closed in their faces, sometimes literally, but a few of the villagers welcomed them, particularly after Reverend Phillips at St. James vouched for the academic legitimacy of their work. "They're private people," the Reverend explained after introducing them to Margaret Walsham, an elderly woman whose family had lived in Dunwich for at least 5 generations. "Outsiders usually come to mock or sensationalize our ways. We're only interested in documenting and understanding," Marcus assured him, while Emma nodded earnestly beside him. Margaret Walsham's cottage was a living museum of folk traditions. Bundles of herbs hung from the rafters, handmade corn dollies occupied a shelf above the fireplace, and intricate knotwork patterns had been carved into the wooden lintels above every doorway and window. "My great-grandmother taught my grandmother, who taught my mother, who taught me," Margaret explained as she prepared tea for her visitors. "The old ways keep the old dangers at bay." "Like the Black Shuck?" Emma asked, ignoring Marcus's warning glance. Margaret's hand stilled momentarily as she poured the tea. "We don't speak its name inside a dwelling," she said softly. "Names have power." "I apologize," Emma said quickly. "I didn't mean to offend." Margaret nodded in acceptance of the apology but offered no further opening on the subject. Instead, she guided the conversation toward less sensitive aspects of local tradition, seasonal celebrations, food preservation techniques, weather prediction methods passed down through generations. As they were leaving, however, Margaret took Emma's hand at the door. Her fingers were gnarled with arthritis but surprisingly strong. "You have an explorer's spirit," the old woman said. "But some things are best left unexplored. If you hear the bells stop ringing and find yourself alone in the fog, keep your eyes down and your mind clear. Don't look for what might be looking for you." Emma began, but Margaret released her hand and stepped back inside, closing the door firmly. "What was that about?" Emma asked as they walked back toward their cottage. Marcus frowned. "A warning, obviously. One you should heed." Emma didn't respond, but her mind was already forming plans for twilight filming along the coastal paths where, according to her preliminary research, most historical sightings of the spectral hound had occurred. The days lengthened toward midsummer, but Dr. Blackwood kept them busy with daytime documentation work, seeming to deliberately schedule their activities to conclude before sunset. They collected dozens of interviews about traditional practices, recorded seasonal cooking demonstrations, and documented protective symbols carved into buildings throughout the village. Yet Emma couldn't shake her fascination with the legend they weren't supposed to discuss. She found herself lingering whenever the conversation approached the subject of the Black Shuck, hoping for scraps of information. The locals remained tight-lipped, but she gradually assembled fragments of the legend from old books in the village's tiny library and cautious references in their interviews. The Black Shuck was said to be larger than any natural dog, with fur as dark as a starless night and eyes that glowed like embers. It appeared in coastal fog, often presaged by the silencing of ambient sounds. Birds falling quiet, insects ceasing their chirping, even church bells deadening mid-ring. To see the Shuck was a death omen, but to meet its gaze directly meant instant death or madness. Some versions of the legend claimed it was a soul collector for those whose time had come, while others suggested it was drawn to those who harbored secret guilt. Most intriguingly to Emma, the oldest accounts connected the Black Shuck to the ruins of Dunwich that now lay beneath the waves, suggesting the creature was somehow connected to the sea's consumption of the land, a guardian of the threshold between worlds. As the new moon approached in late June, Emma noticed the villagers beginning unfamiliar preparations. Fresh protective symbols appeared on doorways, painted in what looked suspiciously like blood. Children were called indoors before sunset. Dogs throughout the village were brought inside and secured, some even with multiple locks on their kennels. "Something's happening," she said to Marcus over dinner in their cottage kitchen. "Something connected to the new moon tomorrow night." Marcus nodded reluctantly. "It's their most significant protective observance of the year. The night when the boundary is thinnest, according to local belief." "Boundary between what?" Emma pressed. "Between the world of the living and whatever lies beyond," Marcus said. "I've been invited to observe some of the protective rituals at the church. Reverend Phillips has agreed to let me document them on the condition that I come alone and bring no recording equipment. It's unprecedented access." "What about me?" Emma asked, trying to mask her disappointment. "You're to stay here," Marcus said firmly. "Those were the conditions. One observer only, and I'm the primary researcher." Emma pushed her food around her plate, mind racing. With Marcus occupied at the church and the villagers focused on their protective rituals, tomorrow night would be her perfect opportunity to capture footage of the coastal path and marshlands in the atmospheric conditions central to the Shuck legend. "I understand," she said, affecting resignation. "I'll review our existing footage while you're gone." Marcus studied her face for a moment, clearly suspicious of her easy acquiescence, but eventually nodded. "Good. This access is too valuable to jeopardize." The following day passed with agonizing slowness for Emma. She went through the motions of their scheduled interviews, checked and rechecked her camera equipment, and packed a small bag with necessities for night filming. Extra batteries, a powerful flashlight, a compass, and a detailed map of the coastal paths. As evening approached, the village grew eerily quiet. Doors and windows were shut tight despite the summer warmth. The few villagers still outside moved with purpose, completing last-minute errands before hurrying home. Even the usually raucous seagulls seemed subdued, as if sensing the village's unease. At sunset, Marcus prepared to leave for the church. "Remember what I said," he told Emma sternly. "Stay in the cottage. The locals take this night very seriously, and I won't have you disturbing their observances or endangering our research." "Of course," Emma assured him. "I've got plenty to keep me busy here." As soon as Marcus was out of sight, Emma sprang into action. She changed into dark clothing, shouldered her equipment bag, and slipped out the back door of the cottage. The sky still held the last lavender light of the longest days of the year, but darkness would fall soon, and with it, she hoped, the atmospheric fog that would make her footage extraordinary. Emma made her way to the coastal path that wound north from the village, following the route where multiple historical sightings had reportedly occurred. The path skirted dangerous cliff edges in places, but she'd studied the map carefully and brought her compass. Besides, she planned to remain within a mile of the village, close enough to return quickly if necessary. As the last light faded from the sky, Emma found a promising promontory overlooking both the village to the south and the marshlands to the north. She set up her tripod and camera, framing a wide shot that captured the distant lights of Dunwich against the darkening landscape. The conditions were perfect. The air had the heavy stillness that often preceded coastal fog, and without a moon, the stars were emerging with remarkable clarity. "Perfect," she murmured. starting a time-lapse recording that would capture the anticipated fog rolling in. She settled onto a rock nearby, prepared for a long wait. The night deepened around her. The temperature dropped noticeably, and Emma pulled her jacket tighter. From the distant village came the sound of St. James's Church bells, ringing an unfamiliar pattern, not marking the hour, but something else, something rhythmic and somehow urgent. Checking her camera, Emma noticed the first tendrils of fog appearing at the edges of her frame, creeping in from the sea and across the marshes. Soon, the fog would transform the landscape into the otherworldly scene she'd envisioned for her documentary. The church bells continued their strange pattern as the fog thickened, but Emma's attention was drawn to something else, a change in the quality of the darkness within the fog banks to the north. Something was moving there, something large enough to displace the fog as it passed. Emma adjusted her camera, zooming in on the disturbance. Through the viewfinder, she could see the fog swirling as if around an invisible presence moving steadily southward, toward the village. Toward her. A shiver passed through her that had nothing to do with the dropping temperature. For the first time, Emma wondered if she'd been reckless. The village's obvious fear suddenly seemed less like superstition and more like the wisdom of experience. She was considering packing up her equipment when the church bells stopped abruptly, mid-toll. The silence that followed was absolute. No wind in the grass. No distant surf. No calling birds. Nothing but the sound of Emma's increasingly rapid heartbeat. If you hear no sound but your own heartbeat in the fog, run. The Black Shuck has come to claim a soul. Margaret Walsham's warning echoed in Emma's mind as she stared at the approaching disturbance in the fog. It was too late to run. Whatever was coming was between her and the village. Too late to hide. The promontory offered no concealment. All she could do was stand her ground and face what approached. The fog parted. What emerged was both exactly what Emma had expected and utterly different from anything she could have imagined. It had the shape of a dog, yes, but the resemblance ended there. Its proportions were wrong, shoulders too high, legs too long, head too massive for even the largest mastiff. It moved with a liquid grace that belied its size, as if gravity exerted less influence upon it than upon ordinary creatures. But it was the hound's eyes that froze Emma in place, twin orbs that burned with their own internal light, not reflecting illumination but generating it. They cast a sickly glow on the fog around the creature's head, revealing a muzzle too long and teeth too numerous for any natural canid. The Black Shuck halted about 20 paces from Emma, its massive head lowering as it seemed to evaluate her. Despite every legend warning against it, despite Margaret's explicit caution, Emma found she couldn't look away from those burning eyes. They held her as surely as if physical bonds connected them. In their depths, Emma saw not animal awareness but something ancient and knowing. Something that recognized her specifically, not as prey or threat, but as expected. "I'm not afraid of you," Emma heard herself say, the words escaping without conscious thought. The Black Shuck tilted its head slightly, almost quizzically. Then it took a deliberate step forward. Emma's paralysis broke. She stumbled backward, reaching for her tripod as both support and potential weapon. Her elbow struck the camera, knocking it from its perch. It tumbled over the cliff edge, disappearing into the fog below. When Emma looked back, the Shuck was closer, much closer than a single step should have brought it. Its eyes had changed, the coal-red glow now shot through with threads of blue-white light like distant lightning. "Run!" The imperative finally reached Emma's fear-frozen muscles. She turned and fled along the cliff path, no longer caring about her equipment, caring only about putting distance between herself and those terrible knowing eyes. The fog thickened around her, disorienting her. The path, so clear earlier, now seemed to fork and wind unpredictably. Heavy, rhythmic sounds pursued her, not the obvious gallop of a large dog, but something more deliberate. Patiently pursuing. Unhurried. Emma stumbled down what she desperately hoped was the path to the village. Her foot caught on an exposed root, and she fell hard, the impact driving the breath from her lungs. She gasped, struggling to her feet, and found herself at the edge of the cliff. The fog parted momentarily, revealing the dizzying drop to the rocks and surf below. The coast had eroded significantly since her map had been printed. The path she'd been following no longer connected to the village. It now led only to this precipice. Emma stepped back from the edge, heart hammering. She had to retrace her steps, find where she'd gone wrong, locate the true path back to safety. She turned, and found herself face to face with the Black Shuck. Up close, the creature's size was even more impossible. Its shoulder stood level with Emma's chest. Its breath smelled of salt water and decay. Those burning eyes, now level with her own, seemed to contain moving images, shapes and scenes just beyond clear perception. Emma wanted to scream, but her throat constricted around any sound. She wanted to run, but the cliff edge yawned behind her. She wanted to fight, but her limbs felt distant and unresponsive. The Shuck lowered its massive head and sniffed at Emma's jacket pocket, the pocket containing her compass. With surprising delicacy, the creature took the edge of the pocket in its teeth and tugged, pulling the compass free. It fell to the ground between them. Emma stared at the compass, then at the Shuck. The creature's gaze seemed almost expectant. With movements that felt oddly dreamlike, Emma knelt and picked up the compass. The needle spun wildly, rotating in complete circles rather than settling toward north. "I'm lost," Emma whispered, understanding finally penetrating her terror. The Black Shuck made a sound low in its throat, not quite a growl, not quite a whine. It turned slightly, presenting its flank to her, then looked back at her with those burning eyes. With a clarity that defied rational explanation, Emma suddenly understood. The Shuck was offering guidance. A way back. Every legend warned against following the Black Shuck. It led souls to their doom, to the underworld, to whatever waited beyond death. But Emma stood on a crumbling precipice in a disorienting fog with no path back to safety. Whatever the creature's true nature, she had only two choices: trust it or face the cliff. "Show me the way back," she said, her voice steadier than she expected. The Shuck turned and padded into the fog. After a moment's hesitation, Emma followed. They traced a winding path through the mist, the massive Hound always just visible ahead. It led her away from the cliff edge, along what felt like solid ground but corresponded to no path Emma had seen on her map. Several times, they passed perilously close to sudden drop-offs revealed by momentary clearings in the fog, places where the coast had surrendered more territory to the hungry sea. Eventually, Emma began to see lights ahead, the village. Relief flooded through her as she recognized the distinctive silhouette of St. James Church against the night sky. The Black Shuck had indeed led her back to safety. She turned to look at her guide, to thank it, absurdly, but the creature was no longer beside her. Instead, it stood some distance away, atop a small rise, its burning gaze still fixed on Emma. As she watched, the Shuck threw back its head in a silent howl, its outline seeming to blur and expand momentarily. Then it turned and loped away, quickly vanishing into the fog. Emma made her way down to the village, where she found an unexpected scene. Villagers with lanterns and torches were gathered in small search parties, and she could hear her own name being called from different directions. Among the searchers were Marcus and Reverend Phillips, both looking grave and frightened. "Emma!" Marcus spotted her first, rushing to her side. "Thank God. Where have you been? What happened to you? I went to film on the coastal path, Emma admitted, too exhausted for lies. The fog came in, and I got lost. You fool, Marcus said, but there was more relief than anger in his voice. This night of all nights, do you have any idea the danger you were in? I think I do, Emma said quietly. Word of her return spread quickly through the search parties. As the villagers gathered around, Emma noticed Margaret Walsham among them, watching her with an inscrutable expression. Did you see anything in the fog? Reverend Phillips asked carefully. Emma opened her mouth to describe her encounter, then hesitated, looking at the faces around her. These people had lived with the legend of the Black Shuck for generations. They feared it, yes, but they also respected it, maintained traditions to ward it off, kept its nature secret from outsiders. I got turned around in the fog, Emma said finally. Lost the path. But I found my way back. She wasn't sure, but she thought she saw Margaret Walsham nod slightly in approval. The search parties disbanded, returning to their homes now that the crisis had passed. Marcus insisted they go immediately back to their cottage, where he built up the fire despite the summer warmth and pressed a mug of hot, sweet tea into Emma's hands. You could have died out there, he said, pacing the small kitchen. The cliff paths are treacherous enough in daylight. In fog, on a night like this, he broke off, shaking his head. I'm sorry, Emma said, and meant it. I was arrogant. I thought I knew better than people who've lived with these traditions for generations. Marcus stopped pacing and studied her face. Did something happen out there? Something you didn't want to tell the villagers? Emma sipped her tea, considering how to answer. I think I understand now why they hang bells above their doors, she said finally. And why they bring their dogs inside on nights when there's no moon. Marcus waited, clearly expecting more, but Emma offered nothing further. Some experiences defied academic documentation. Some encounters were too personal, too transformative to be reduced to field notes or visual evidence. Besides, her camera, with any footage it might have captured, lay shattered at the base of the cliff. In the days that followed, Emma noticed subtle changes in how the villagers treated her. Where before there had been suspicion or indifference, now there was a quiet acknowledgement, nods from fishermen as they headed to their boats, small gifts of freshly baked bread left on their cottage doorstep, an invitation to Margaret Walsham's home for tea just to talk. During that tea visit, when Marcus was conducting interviews elsewhere in the village, the old woman finally broached the subject directly. You saw it, didn't you? Margaret asked, watching Emma over the rim of her teacup. Out in the fog. Emma nodded slowly. Yes. And yet here you sit, Margaret continued. Most who look into those eyes don't live to speak of it. It guided me, Emma said, struggling to articulate the experience. Back to the village, away from the cliff edge. It saved me. Margaret set down her cup. The old stories say it hunts those whose time has come, those who harbor secret guilt, or those who ignore warnings out of pride. She gave Emma a meaningful look at this last point. Perhaps I qualified on that third count, Emma admitted. Perhaps, Margaret agreed. Or perhaps you encountered it for another reason entirely. What do you mean? Margaret rose and crossed to an old chest in the corner of her cottage. From it, she withdrew a framed daguerreotype showing a stern-faced woman in Victorian dress standing beside a seated man. My great-great-grandmother, she said, handing the frame to Emma. Eleanor Walsham. Emma studied the image politely, not understanding its relevance until Margaret pointed to a detail in the background. A carved wooden plaque bearing a family crest. At its center was the silhouette of a large, wolfish dog. The Walsham family didn't always fear the Black Shuck, Margaret explained. According to our oldest family stories, there was a time when it was our guardian, a protector of our bloodline. What changed? Emma asked, fascinated despite herself. Progress, Margaret said with a hint of bitterness. Education. Modern thinking. My grandfather was the first Walsham to attend university in London. He came back with new ideas, new beliefs. He dismissed the old ways as superstition, much as you did. She took back the photograph, gazing at it with an expression of mingled pride and sadness. Some in our family continued the traditions in secret, but much was lost. The Shuck was no longer honored, no longer recognized as protector. Eventually, it became what the village feared, a harbinger of death, a collector of souls. We forgot how to distinguish friend from foe. Emma thought of those burning eyes, of the shocking intelligence she'd seen within them. You think it recognized something in me? Margaret smiled faintly. Who can say why the old powers do what they do? But consider this, Emma Lloyd, of all the souls abroad on a night when the boundary was thinnest, it was you the Shuck found in the fog. You it chose to guide rather than hunt. Emma left Margaret's cottage with more questions than answers, but also with a profound sense that she'd been granted insight into something ancient and significant. Her encounter on the cliff wasn't just a brush with folklore come to life, it was a glimpse behind the veil that separated the rational modern world from older, deeper truths. As their research in Dunwich concluded, Emma found herself collecting different material than she'd originally planned. Rather than sensationalizing the Black Shuck legend for dramatic effect, she documented the protective traditions with newfound respect. The bell hanging, the symbol painting, the sacred observances that maintained boundaries between worlds. Marcus noticed the change in her approach but didn't question it directly. Instead, he incorporated her new material seamlessly into their joint research, tacitly acknowledging the value of her perspective. On their last evening in Dunwich, Emma took a solitary walk along the village's main street as sunset painted the sky in shades of amber and rose. When she reached St. James' Church, she paused, drawn by an impulse she didn't fully understand. Inside, Reverend Phillips was arranging prayer books in the pews. He nodded a greeting to Emma without surprise, as if he'd been expecting her. "I'm leaving tomorrow," Emma said. "I wanted to thank you for allowing us to document your community's traditions." "You've approached them with respect," the Reverend replied, "particularly after your experience on the new moon night." Emma's hand went instinctively to her jacket pocket, where she now carried a small handmade bell Margaret Walsham had given her as a parting gift. "I learned something important that night." "Oh." The Reverend's tone was carefully neutral. "That some boundaries shouldn't be crossed casually," Emma said. "And that sometimes, the old ways persist for good reasons." Reverend Phillips smiled slightly. "A valuable lesson for an anthropologist." "And for a person," Emma added. As she turned to leave, the Reverend spoke again. "The church bells," he said. "The pattern we ring on the new moon night." "Yes. It's not to ward off the Black Shuck, as many believe. The oldest parish records suggest it was originally rung to guide it, to show the boundary between worlds so the guardian would know where to patrol." Emma thought of the bells falling silent just before the Shuck appeared. Not because its presence silenced them, perhaps, but because their purpose had been fulfilled. The guardian had arrived. "Thank you," she said, though she wasn't entirely sure what she was thanking him for. That night, as Emma finished packing for their departure, a fog rolled in from the sea, unseasonable for midsummer, the villagers would later say. Standing at her cottage window, Emma watched it creep through the darkened streets of Dunwich. For a moment, just a moment, she thought she saw a large, dark shape moving through the mist, passing beneath a streetlight without casting a shadow. Then it was gone, like a memory of something half glimpsed, half imagined. Emma closed the curtains and turned away from the window. Some guardian presences were best left to their ancient duties, unobserved by those they protected. Some knowledge was meant to be carried quietly, honored through respect rather than academic documentation. The Black Shuck would continue its eternal patrol along the crumbling coast of East Anglia, moving between worlds as it had for centuries. And Emma Lloyd would carry what she'd learned in the fog, that sometimes what we fear most isn't what comes hunting for us in the darkness, but what we discover about ourselves when we look into eyes older than human memory and see ourselves reflected there, known and judged and, sometimes, guided home. The Black Shuck still patrols the foggy coasts of East Anglia, eyes burning in the mist, marking the boundary between our world and what lies beyond. But is it a harbinger of doom or an ancient protector? What do you think? Our channel explores the world's most compelling folklore legends, uncovering the deeper truths behind stories that have persisted for centuries. If you enjoyed this journey into England's supernatural realm, help this channel grow by subscribing, hitting the notification bell, and sharing with fellow folklore enthusiasts. Does your region have legends of spectral animals or protective spirits? Perhaps a harbinger of death similar to the Black Shuck? Share your local folklore in the comments below. Your story might inspire our next video. Together we're building a global archive of supernatural tales that might otherwise be forgotten.